There is a particular kind of silence that historians don't talk about. Not the silence of incomplete records, not the ordinary erosion of documents across centuries of wars and fires and floods. I mean a different kind of silence entirely, a surgical silence. The kind that appears not where nothing happened, but precisely where something enormous happened, and someone decided the record should reflect otherwise. The kind of silence that has a shape, the kind you can trace with your finger along the edges of what isn't there, and feel, with uncomfortable certainty, that the absence was deliberate. That is the silence I want to talk about tonight, because here is a fact that should trouble you far more than it does. The Russian Empire fought one of the longest, costliest, most consequential military campaigns in the history of Eurasian civilization, and left almost no coherent record of doing so. Not because the records were lost, not because the empire lacked the administrative capacity to document its own wars. The Romanov bureaucracy was one of the most exhaustively documented institutional systems in modern history. They recorded grain shipments. They logged the names of individual serfs. They tracked the movement of cattle across provincial borders. These were not people who forgot to write things down. And yet, when you go looking for the war that appears to have consumed an enormous portion of the empire's financial resources across the better part of 2 centuries, the war that correlates with the disappearance of an entire geopolitical entity from European maps, the war that may have done more to destabilize the Romanov dynasty than Napoleon and the Japanese fleet combined, you find almost nothing. Not fragments, not partial accounts, almost nothing. A silence so complete, so consistent, so perfectly shaped around a specific geography and a specific time period that it stops feeling like negligence and starts feeling like architecture. This raises a simple but critical question: what exactly are the Romanov records hiding? And why does the answer appear to be buried not in some forgotten archive, but in a set of financial documents that nobody ever thought to read as evidence of concealment? Let me start with something concrete. Something that cannot be dismissed as speculation or pattern-seeking, or the kind of imaginative overreach that skeptics reach for when a question makes them uncomfortable. Let me start with the numbers. By the early 20th century, the Russian Empire was one of the most heavily indebted sovereign states on Earth. French investors alone held the equivalent of billions in modern currency worth of Russian government bonds. British capital had financed railway construction across Siberian distances that stagger the imagination even now. German banking houses had participated in sovereign lending to a government they would shortly be at war with. The financial exposure of Western European capital to the Romanov state was, by any measure, extraordinary. And the standard explanations for this debt are not wrong exactly, they are simply insufficient. Yes, the Napoleonic invasion of 1812 was expensive. Yes, the Crimean War of 1853 drained the treasury. Yes, industrialization required capital that the Russian domestic market could not fully supply. All of this is true and documented and uncontested. But here is what the official explanation cannot account for. When you map the borrowing cycles of the Russian Empire across 2 centuries and compare them against the documented costs of its acknowledged wars, a discrepancy emerges. Not a small one. Not the kind of variance you'd attribute to accounting inefficiency or bureaucratic rounding. A structural discrepancy, a persistent gap between the visible wars and the visible debt that cannot be closed by any combination of modernization costs, agricultural investment, or industrial expansion. The borrowing outpaces the explanation, and it does so with a consistency that looks, once you actually examine it, less like mismanagement and more like concealment. This is where the silence begins to have a shape, because if you ask where that money went, the trail leads east. It always leads east, into the vast territories that older maps labeled with a name that is no longer considered acceptable in mainstream historical discourse. A name that appears on Dutch atlases, French encyclopedias, British trade maps, and Russian administrative documents across the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century, and then fades with a speed and thoroughness that has no parallel in the history of cartography. A name that was never officially dissolved, never formally absorbed, never subjected to the kind of transitional documentation that even the most casual territorial transfer between minor European principalities would have generated. Tartaria, or Tartari, depending on your source and your century. I want to be precise about what I mean when I use that name. Because precision is exactly what the official narrative refuses to provide. On European maps from the 16 and 1700s, Tartaria was not a vague placeholder for unexplored wilderness. It was a defined geopolitical space, differentiated from Muscovy, differentiated from China, differentiated from the Ottoman sphere, and labeled with the same matter-of-fact certainty that cartographers applied to France or Persia. It had internal subdivisions: Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary, Russian Tartary. These were not the labels of confusion. They were the labels of a recognized, complex, structured reality that European diplomats, merchants, and military planners understood as distinct from the Russian state that would eventually claim to speak for it. And then it disappears. Not slowly, not through the gradual, documented process by which empires typically absorb their neighbors. It simply stops appearing. The name fades across European atlases during the same century that the Romanov Empire is expanding east, with a military commitment that the official record never quite adequately explains. The timing is not approximate, it is precise. And precision in the relationship between political erasure and cartographic revision is not a coincidence. It is a methodology. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly was being erased, and what did erasing it cost? Consider what a war without a name would look like in the historical record. Not a war against a foreign nation, with a recognized government and a diplomatic identity that would require formal declarations and treaty negotiations and acknowledged casualties. Something more complicated than that. Something more like the dismantling of a distributed system. A network of semi-autonomous polities, caravan cities, trade routes, administrative structures, and regional poor centers that had functioned across northern Asia for generations without being organized under a single banner that Western diplomacy could easily categorize or dismiss. Something that, when you tried to conquer it, kept not quite being conquered, kept requiring another campaign, another garrison, another decade of military presence in a geography that punished military presence with brutal efficiency. That kind of war would not look like Austerlitz. It would not produce the kinds of records that military historians love: the orders of battle, the casualty lists, the surrender documents, the peace treaties. It would produce something much harder to document and much easier to subsequently deny. It would produce decades of frontier expenditure, sustained troop deployments with no single decisive engagement to point to, fortification networks built across distances that make the mind reel, administrative restructuring that quietly reclassified occupied territories as always having been Russian, always having been empty, always having been simply waiting for the civilization that arrived to claim them. It would produce, in other words, exactly the kind of financial record that the Romanov Empire actually left behind. Now, I want you to hold something in mind, because it is the centerpiece of everything that follows. The absence of a war's documentation is not, by itself, proof that the war didn't happen. Archives burn, records deteriorate, bureaucracies lose things. All of this is true, and I am not asking you to set it aside. What I am asking you to consider is something more specific than mere absence. I am asking you to consider the pattern of the absence, because not all of the documentation is missing. The Romanov records are, in many areas, exhaustive. The fiscal accounts from European-facing operations, from the Napoleonic campaigns, from the Crimean engagement, these exist in substantial detail. The diplomatic correspondence surrounding the acknowledged wars is rich and multilingual and archived across multiple national collections. But the Eastern administrative records from the same period present a different picture entirely. Not uniformly absent, which would itself be suspicious. Selectively absent. Fragmented in ways that consistently remove the specific information that would answer the specific questions our hypothesis demands. The granular military expenditure breakdowns for frontier operations. The casualty tallies from the multi-decade Caucasus campaigns, the administrative transition documents that should exist when a region moves from one system of governance to another, the fiscal records from newly incorporated Eastern territories in the decades immediately following incorporation. These are not the gaps of ordinary archival entropy. These are gaps that have a direction, gaps that consistently point away from the question of what the Eastern expansion actually cost and what it actually encountered. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean by directed silence. The Caucasus War. This is a conflict that official Russian history acknowledges, at least in outline. A military campaign in the mountainous territories south of the Russian heartland, beginning in the early 19th century, and stretching in various forms for nearly half a century. Officially, it is framed as a pacification campaign against scattered mountain peoples resisting imperial authority. A frontier operation, a policing action on a grand scale, but the scale itself refuses to stay within that framing. The resources committed to the Caucasus campaigns over those decades, the manpower, the artillery, the engineering infrastructure, the sustained logistical commitment, were not the resources you deploy against scattered resistance. They were the resources you deploy against an organized opponent with the capacity for sustained, coordinated defense. And the duration, nearly 50 years of active military engagement in a single theater, is a number that the framing of pacification simply cannot contain. Scattered tribes do not require 50 years to pacify. Organized systems with established hierarchies, supply networks, and territorial memory do. The official explanation collapses here, not because the events themselves are disputed, but because the explanation offered for those events cannot bear the weight of the actual numbers attached to them. And this is precisely where the financial record becomes revelatory in a way that no single document could be. Because the Caucasus campaigns were not the only Eastern engagement of the Romanov 19th century. Simultaneously, further east, the Central Asian incorporation was underway. The absorption of Bukhara, of Kokand, of Khiva, of territories that older maps had placed within the broader Tartarian sphere. These operations were documented as swift, decisive, almost administrative in their ease. And yet, again, the financial record tells a different story. Sustained expenditure, prolonged garrison costs, infrastructure investment at scales that don't correspond to the official narrative of effortless integration. You cannot maintain garrisons in a territory you have peacefully incorporated for the same cost as garrisons in a territory that is actively resisting you. The numbers know the difference, even when the narrative doesn't. This raises a simple but critical question. If the Eastern campaigns were as straightforward as official history suggests, why do the financial records look like the records of an empire fighting for its life, on a front it never officially acknowledged? Now, let me introduce the element that I find most difficult to explain away: the Trans-Siberian Railway. Initiated in 1891 under Alexander III and continued under Nicholas II, this was one of the largest infrastructure projects in human history, spanning thousands of kilometers across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, connecting the Western imperial heartland to the Pacific coast. The official explanation positions this as economic development, a modernization project, the natural ambition of a forward-thinking empire, opening its eastern territories to commerce and settlement. But here is what that explanation requires you to ignore. By 1891, according to official history, Siberia had been under stable Russian administrative control for the better part of 2 centuries. If that control was genuine, if the territories were truly integrated, if the eastern expansion had proceeded as smoothly as the narrative suggests, then the urgency of unified logistical connection would be difficult to account for. You build railways to move goods and people efficiently. You also build them, in a context of contested territorial control, to move armies quickly. The Trans-Siberian Railway was both, and the military logic of it only makes sense if the territories it connected were not as securely held as the official record claimed. Railroads bind empires. They project central authority into distant spaces. They compress geography in the service of power. The urgency with which the Romanov state pursued Siberian rail connection at enormous financial cost, during a period when the treasury was already strained, suggests that something in the East was still not resolved, something that required the physical capacity to deploy force rapidly across continental distances. Something that the empire, for all its territorial claims, did not feel entirely confident it controlled. And the debt for that railway joined the growing pile of debt that the official explanation cannot quite account for. French bondholders financed portions of it. The treasury strained further. Foreign dependency deepened. And the question of why an empire of such immense territorial wealth required so much external capital to hold itself together grew louder in the financial record, even as it went unasked in the official narrative. The silence was deafening. I want to talk now about something that I think is the most underexamined aspect of this entire question. Not the military evidence, not the cartographic evidence, not even the financial evidence, as compelling as all of that is. I want to talk about what the Romanov records actually say about the territories they were incorporating, because here is where the directed nature of the silence becomes almost impossible to attribute to accident. Early traveler accounts from Russian explorers and administrators entering Siberian territories describe encountering things that don't appear in later official summaries. Structured settlements, established trade networks, evidence of prior administrative organization, buildings that predated Russian arrival, routes that were already worn smooth by generations of use. The raw material of a civilization that had been there before them, organized and operating in ways that the frontier narrative simply has no room for. These accounts exist. Some of them made it into print, tucked into the footnotes of geographical journals, referenced in passing by travelers who assumed their observations were unremarkable because they were simply describing what they saw. And then, in the subsequent consolidation of official Russian historiography across the 19th century, those details begin to disappear. Not the accounts themselves, in every case, but the details within them that contradict the emptiness the official narrative required. The references to prior settlements become references to nomadic encampments. The established routes become animal trails. The buildings of uncertain origin become primitive shelters. This is not the erasure of history. It is something more sophisticated than that. It is the reinterpretation of history, the rendering of complexity into simplicity, in a way that serves a specific political need. And the political need it serves is the same one that explains the financial silence, the cartographic revision, and the 50 years of underdocumented military engagement in the East. The need to inherit a world without acknowledging what that inheritance cost or what it displaced. Because here is the thing about inheritance that empires prefer not to discuss. When you inherit a structure, you take on its obligations. When you absorb a trade network, you absorb its relationships. When you occupy a city, you occupy its memory. And memory is stubborn. It persists in the land itself, in the routes people still walk, in the buildings that stand longer than the empires that claim them, in the financial obligations of conquest that compound in silence across generations of borrowers who never quite understood what they were paying for. The Romanov debts were that memory expressed in numbers. Now, I want to bring this to the question of collapse, because this is where the hypothesis stops being historical curiosity and starts being something with consequences that extend beyond the archives. The Romanov dynasty fell in 1917. The official explanation for that fall is layered and complex and not without merit. Revolutionary ideology, the catastrophic military losses of the First World War, the internal contradictions of a feudal system attempting rapid modernization, the specific failures of Nicholas II as a leader. All of these played roles, and I am not dismissing any of them. But underneath all of those proximate causes lay a structural condition that the official explanation tends to minimize. By 1914, when the empire entered the war that would ultimately destroy it, the financial architecture of the Romanov state was already critically compromised. The debt structure was not the result of the war. The war simply made it impossible to continue servicing a debt structure that had been building for generations. French creditors held leverage that transcended diplomatic alliance. Foreign capital had become so embedded in Russian infrastructure that the line between investment and dependency had long since dissolved. The empire that went to war in 1914 was not a sovereign financial actor. It was a heavily leveraged institution whose creditors were, in the most meaningful sense, also its proprietors. And that leverage did not emerge from the acknowledged wars. It emerged from the sustained, underdocumented, never officially named campaign of Eastern consolidation that the financial records point toward, and the official narrative refuses to describe. This raises a simple but critical question. Would the Romanov dynasty have survived the First World War if its treasury had not already been hollowed out by a century of concealed conquest? Would 1917 have happened on schedule if the empire's financial architecture had been built on transparent, sustainable foundations, rather than on the compounding debt of a war that could never be admitted to have taken place? We cannot know. History does not offer controlled experiments. But the question is worth sitting with, because if the answer is no, If the bankruptcy of the Russian Empire was the delayed consequence of a war fought in silence across the Eurasian interior, then what we call the Russian Revolution begins to look less like a political event and more like a financial reckoning. Not the overthrow of an empire by its own people, but the collapse of a debt structure that had been unsustainable since the moment it was incurred. The revolutionaries did not topple a functioning institution. They toppled a hollowed shell, one that had been emptied from the inside over the course of 2 centuries by the compounding cost of erasing what had existed before. And the people who presented the bill were not standing in the streets of Petrograd. They were sitting in banking houses in Paris and London, watching their bonds default, with the quiet grief of investors who had understood the risk and taken it anyway, because the returns had been extraordinary while they lasted. The silence was deafening. Let me now address the question that I know is forming in the minds of those of you who approach this kind of material with appropriate skepticism. Because I think skepticism is not only reasonable here, it is necessary. The argument I am making is not that I have discovered a hidden archive proving the existence of a Tartarian empire and a Romanov war against it. I have not. No such archive has emerged, and I will not pretend otherwise. What I am arguing is something more precise and, I think, more defensible than that. I am arguing that the financial record of the Russian Empire contains a structural anomaly that the official explanation cannot account for. I am arguing that the cartographic record shows a revision of unprecedented scope occurring during the same period as that anomaly. I am arguing that the military record from the Eastern campaigns shows a scale of commitment that the official framing of frontier pacification cannot contain. And I am arguing that when you place those 3 observations side by side and ask what explanation could account for all of them simultaneously, the official narrative fails and the hypothesis of a prolonged, undeclared, deliberately underdocumented campaign of Eastern absorption succeeds. That is not proof. I want to be clear about that. It is pattern. And patterns in historical evidence, when they are sufficiently consistent and when they point consistently in the same direction, deserve more than dismissal. They deserve investigation. They deserve the kind of rigorous, funded, institutionally supported inquiry that this particular set of questions has, with remarkable consistency, failed to attract. And the failure to attract that inquiry is itself part of the pattern. Because here is what I keep returning to. When an historical anomaly exists, when there is a genuine discrepancy between what the evidence suggests and what the official narrative claims, the normal response of academic institutions is to investigate, to fund research, to commission studies, to generate debate. This is how knowledge advances. This is how the historical record corrects itself over time. But the questions surrounding Tartaria, the Romanov debts, the cartographic revision, and the underdocumented Eastern campaigns have not generated that response. They have generated something else. Not refutation. Refutation requires engagement, and engagement requires acknowledgement that the question is worth asking. They have generated dismissal. The specific, targeted, professionally enforced dismissal that signals not that a question has been answered, but that a question has been deemed unanswerable by prior agreement. Why? That is the question I cannot answer with confidence, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I can observe that the dismissal is consistent, that it appears across disciplines that otherwise compete with each other, that it has been sustained across generations of scholars who would, in other contexts, relish the opportunity to overturn established narratives. And that the consistency of that dismissal, across so many different academic contexts, begins to look less like independent consensus and more like a shared understanding that certain questions lead somewhere that institutions would prefer not to go. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is what I believe the evidence supports, stated as carefully and as honestly as I can manage. The Russian Empire's expansion across the Eurasian interior during the 18th and 19th centuries was substantially more contested, substantially more costly, and substantially more consequential than official history acknowledges. The territories it absorbed were not empty. They were not simply organized at a level that fell beneath the threshold of political recognition. They represented a complex, distributed system of governance, trade, and cultural continuity that required sustained military and administrative effort to dismantle. That effort left a financial trace that cannot be explained by the acknowledged wars alone. And the decision to not name that effort, To not document the full scope of what was encountered and what was overcome was not an oversight. It was a choice, made by people who understood that naming the thing they were erasing would require acknowledging its legitimacy, would require explaining to the European powers whose capital they were borrowing exactly what they were dismantling, would require admitting that the East was not a wilderness waiting to be civilized, but a world that had to be conquered and rewritten at a price they were not prepared to publicly declare. So they did not name it. They borrowed the money, fought the campaigns, redrew the maps, and rewrote the encyclopedias, and trusted that time and institutional silence would complete the erasure. And for the most part, it did. The name faded. The debt was serviced until it wasn't. The campaigns were absorbed into the broader narrative of imperial expansion, labeled as pacification, as settlement, as the natural extension of civilization into frontier territories that had never really been otherwise. What remained was the financial record, stubborn as debt always is, compounding silently across generations of borrowers who inherited the obligation without inheriting the explanation. A century of payments on a war that was never named, never declared, never admitted to have happened, until the treasury that was making those payments ran out of capacity to continue, and the empire that had been built on the erasure of another world finally collapsed under the weight of what that erasure had cost. The buildings are still standing, the maps were redrawn, the encyclopedias were revised, the records were selectively archived, but the numbers remained. And numbers, unlike names, are very difficult to erase entirely. You can rename a territory, you can remove a civilization from the cartographic record, you can decline to document the campaigns that made all of that possible, but the debt that financed it will always be there in the ledger, waiting for someone to ask why the balance never resolved, why the empire was always borrowing, why the treasury was always strained, why an entity of such immense territorial and natural wealth was perpetually, structurally, generationally dependent on the capital of the foreign banking houses it could never quite afford to repay. The war with Tartaria may not have a name. It may not have a treaty or a surrender document or a formal declaration that historians can point to and say, here, this is where it began and this is where it ended. But it has something that history cannot take away from it. It has a bill. An enormous, compounding, generationally inherited bill that the Romanov dynasty paid in silence for 2 centuries and ultimately could not pay at all. And that bill, buried in the financial architecture of a dynasty that fell more than 100 years ago, may be the most honest record we have of a war that the official history of 2 continents agreed, without discussion and without explanation, never to name. The investigation does not end here. It never ends here. The ledger has more pages, the maps have older versions, and somewhere in the space between what the records say and what the records cannot bring themselves to say, the truth is still waiting, not for someone to discover it, for someone to finally be willing to ask why nobody has.